Okay, so the next topic we want to cover briefly is human population growth. So it's important to note that the number of people that are on the planet right now is much, much, much greater than has been for most of human history. So for a long time, we had way less than a million people, a billion people, excuse me, on the entire planet. I'm sure for a long time there were less than a million people too. But so you can see we did not make it to 1 billion people until around the year 1900, approximately that, if that's not the exact year. And then you can see that we have grown very, very quickly. This type of curve is called an exponential curve. What it means is that it increases by a certain percentage each year. So instead of like being a straight line, you might add 2 every year, and then it would be a straight line. But an exponential, if it goes up by 5% or 10% every year, it doesn't seem like much for a long time, but then all of a sudden you hit this turning point and it goes up really, really quickly. So we're at about 8 billion right now, and we keep adding billions at a pretty quick rate. But you can see that for a very, very long time, we were much, much smaller in numbers as a species. This shows a projection into the future. So you can see the last bit of this graph go to 2050 and then 2100. And we see that the rate of population growth has varied over time. So you can see that it was relatively level until you see around 1900, and then around that time we started going up more quickly. And we do see that in more developed regions, the birth rate tends to be lower, and the rate of growth, therefore, is relatively lower as well. In less developed regions, there's less access to birth control. Women have less access to education in most of these areas, and those are the kinds of things that help slow down rates of population growth. And so in these developed regions where many women, finish high school or go to college, like we see here, our rate of growth is pretty slow or pretty stable. And in other areas where women aren't allowed to go to school, or young girls aren't allowed to go to school, we tend to see much, much higher rates of growth. This map shows the projected human population change from 2005 to 2050. And so you can see that it's not even across the entire planet. In different areas, we see faster growths than in other areas. This graph's a little bit strange because gray is in the middle, dark blue is the fastest growth, and then the lighter blues are the least growth. So you can see the lowest growth rates are in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Japan. And then there's a few other places with low growth rates as well. You can see that China is on the lower end, as well as Canada. And then there's a lot of things that are very much in the middle that are gray, like India, Australia, most of South America, the United States, and Mexico. And then there are some things that are growing very quickly, like a lot of sub-Saharan Africa and some places in the Middle East, and a couple of smaller countries in Asia. So you can see this is not spread out evenly. So people's impact on the environment, it definitely depends on how many people there are, but it also depends a lot on what those people do. How do they choose to use resources, and how many resources are used per person. So you can have a lot of people use very few resources, usually if they're in very poor countries. They don't really make a big impact sometimes on environmental resources, or sometimes they overuse them because they're forced to from poverty. Sometimes we just don't have good regulation on the use of different resources, and people use more than they should have share to, and that depletes the resource for everyone. So an example, the term for this is tragedy of the commons. So this is when people overuse an open access or common property resource benefit, and society loses because the costs to society are not taken into account. And sometimes we can lose access to that resource altogether because a few people used it all up, and then it's not available for anyone else. And if we think, what is an open access resource? A really good example is the oceans. So the oceans are being overfished right now, usually by a few companies that are trying to make as much money by fishing as many fish out of the ocean as possible, but that leaves less fish for smaller fishermen to go and use that resource as well. It also depletes some of our marine ecosystems and might damage some of them. So that would be considered a tragedy of the commons because the commons are degraded, these common resources, and a few people benefit, but society overall loses. Sustainable use is kind of the opposite of a tragedy of the commons. Sustainable use is the use of resources that doesn't result in the decline in availability of that resource. So if we take the right amount of a resource and allow it to replenish itself, if it's a renewable resource, then we can use it sustainably for the long term. So sustainable use means that we can keep taking the same amount every year and it will never decline. So if we take the number of new fish that are generated each year, then there will continue to make new fish and we can use that resource for a really long time. But if we take as many fish as we can, there may not be enough fish left to reproduce and make new fish, and that's when we get these tragedy of the commons. So another example is longleaf pine. We know that, as the title says, humans are globally significant consumers of natural resources. We can use a large proportion of what ecosystems produce. 8 billion people is a lot of people, and then some of us use a lot of resources. Usually the people that are more wealthy use many more resources than people that have less money. So this is an example. These are longleaf pine forests. They were the most abundant and very, very large trees. You can see the older illustration here. But they occurred, you can see, in Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast, basically, and the Atlantic coast in these coastal plains in the United States and into Florida. And they were huge trees, and they were really important for a lot of different wildlife. But it turns out they don't grow very fast. So we basically cut almost all of them down and used them for timber, and they were not able to regrow at the rate that we were taking them down. So now there are very few patches of longleaf pine forest remaining, and we've replaced a lot of that with loblolly pine, which is also a native tree, but it's a totally different kind of ecosystem now. And the longleaf pine forest is an endangered ecosystem because of that. So some more evidence about how humans are globally significant consumers of natural resources. We know that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the land surface has been transformed by human action. And that's an old figure. That's from 1997. So it's probably on the higher end of that estimate. At least 83% of the Earth's land surface has been transformed by human activities. That one is from 2002. So we see regardless of what you use, people are using a large proportion of the land on Earth. And you can see in this flow chart, we have the human population. We have different human enterprises here. So the agriculture, industry, recreation, international commerce. This leads to land transformation. So we might clear the land. We might do forestry practices. We might have grazing, or we might do agriculture. This can change the global biogeochemistry, so it can change how elements are cycling through our ecosystems. It also changes the biotic environment, so what species live there and what resources are available. And that can lead to the loss of biological diversity, so extinctions of species or loss of populations, loss of ecosystems like the longleaf pine forest I just talked about. It can also lead to climate change.